Let's pray. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the kindness that you show to us through the example of Jesus here. As we look into Matthew 11 and 12, God, I pray that you would make this text clear to us, that we would see what it is that Matthew was trying to do in presenting this part of his narrative. And God, we pray maybe beyond you working in that typical way that we ask that you do. God, I pray as we think through our lives, as we think about when we're going to be zeroing in on this yoke that Jesus provides to us, that you would help us to consider our lives and to consider the framework that we have, the way that we think through life. There's a specific way that this should be understood as far as the context is concerned, but then the ways that it can be applied to us are more broad than that. And so I pray, help us examine ourselves, help us to ask hard questions of ourselves, help us to see the ways that we live that are similar to how these Pharisees live. Help us, the term is yoke, help us to see the yoke that we have for life that is so much harder to bear than the one that you provide. God, young or old, male or female, saved 2 days, saved 70 years, not yet a believer. God, I pray that you would help us to see that Jesus provides to us something so wonderful, so amazing, so beautiful, so kind and gracious, God, that it is what he says it is. It does appear to be something as we look over it and as we spend more time. I pray that we would see it really is as good as he makes it sound. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, if you're not there yet, open up to Matthew 11. I had Jim read a little more than where we're going to spend our time. For the most part, all we're going to do is zero in on 3 verses. Those are 28, 29, and 30. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Well, we're here at the end of our One Another series. Jeremy will return next week. You can all breathe a sigh of relief. No more Michael. Michael can breathe a sigh of relief. Jeremy's back. No, in jest. I've thoroughly enjoyed being up here. I hope that it has been helpful and beneficial to you. And as we round out, I'm just going to throw this up there one more time. You don't need to see necessarily where we're going because we're there, but you can see where we've been. And if you recall way back when we started this 9-10 weeks ago, I'm not sure which one it was, we started off with love one another. And I worked hard, hopefully, to show well that as new covenant believers, we have a new commandment. And that new commandment is that we allow Jesus to be the one who fulfills the law. It's not us who does this. And the old covenant way of thinking, I said, was to hunt down and look for these commands to obey, and then to obey them, and then to fail in that. And the new covenant way is to say, God is the one who keeps the law for me. And I put that out there because as we were about to walk through these one another's, I didn't want to overburden you. I didn't want this to be an opportunity, and we didn't want this to be an opportunity where this became a whole new list of things that you needed to do. Well, I got to show up at this time, and I've got to do that. Okay, but now I've got these 37 or however many one another's there are, new items to do. We just wanted the gospel to be what moves you. And so I've used this example of a tree before, that we wanted the roots of the knowledge of what God has done for you, like what Paul talks about in Ephesians, the height and the depth and the breadth and the width of the love of God. We wanted that to be what then provides the overflow of the one another's. Or as I said before, that we would have so much joy after looking into the gospel that these one another's really aren't commands. They're more like a way for us to go. Or I use the example of a cup being overflowing with water. and then it needed a place to go. And so the spout was directed in this direction or not directed in that direction. And that's what I'm hoping to do here at the end. I just want to remind us all of the goodness of Jesus to us. Maybe we've got caught up in thinking, well, I've got to now comfort, and I've got to not do this, and I've got to do this. And I want to say, really, you don't have to do any of those. What you have to do is trust that God is good and eat of that goodness. Let it sink down deep into your bones, and then the rest will follow. It will be a natural, foregone conclusion. So today, in looking at this text, I've got 5 steps. I'm going to give you some context like I normally like to do. I'm going to zero in and go over the terms of 28, 29, and 30, deal with what the overall meaning is. I'm going to present to you what I think it's saying, and then I'm going to illustrate to you that this is, I think, Matthew's purpose in this. I'm going to give you the context of 12, and then look at some implications and finally some ways to respond. So first, let's talk context. You are jumping smack dab in the middle of Matthew. I've been here for a week or so. I know what's going on. You don't. So remember, Matthew is all about Jesus being presented as a king. And there are over 100 Old Testament references or allusions that take place in the book of Matthew. That means they're drawing back to the Old Testament Matthew is. And there are 20 of those that deal specifically with Jesus fulfilling messianic prophecies. And so Matthew's big goal is, here is what the Old Testament has talked about. This is the man. And it's written to a Jewish crowd. They would be people who are familiar with terms. That's why we often direct people to John instead of Matthew, because Matthew says some things that are weird to us. They don't make sense contextually. They make sense to a different group of people. And so as a result of that, from our knowledge of what we know of the people that lived during the time of the silence of God, so like the 400 or so years leading up to when Jesus came, and what we know about what took place in the, let's say, 500 or 600 years before that, dealing with the split of the kingdom and all of the prophets speaking about what was to come and Jerusalem being destroyed around 580 or so, we would understand then if the Messiah is promised from how others have treated those that God has produced or put forward, that there's going to be some conflict, right? And a lot of Matthew is about that. You've got Jesus as the Messiah running up against the old guard, that is the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Lots of problems, lots of issues that are there. And we get a little snippet of that where Jim started to read. He says, at that time in verse 25, Jesus declared, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding." And those would be the teachers of the law. And just let your eyes go up to 20 through 24. Don't worry about what the text says so much as if you have a heading that's above there. These are woes that Jesus pronounces against some people. The basic gist is he's gone to Jerusalem. He's presented to them that the kingdom is coming. And for the most part, what he's done has been met with unbelief. And Matthew's dealt with that already in the chapters leading up to this. And then immediately following our context, what Jim read in 12 through 14, it starts us off on this example of how what Jesus says about these Pharisees, that their yoke is really difficult and their burden is really heavy. He's going to show that as an example. So that's what's going on, bookending our text today on the front side and on the back side. Let's deal with some terms. And maybe if you're a note taker, just do me a favor. Don't be overwhelmed by this. There is a YouTube channel I really enjoy watching. If you want to check it out, it's called Veritasium. It's a man named Derek who's about my age. He's a very, very intelligent man, and he talks about all kinds of different things. His videos are more on the lengthy side, let's say 18 to 30 minutes or so, and he deals with concepts that regard oftentimes physics, oftentimes the universe, how Einstein thought, and he has this video that he put out a couple weeks ago that attacks this idea that there are only 4 types of learners, and you are primarily one type of learner and not another. And in the video, he lays out that actually we're all 4 of those types of learners plus more. Yes, it's okay to have generalities. So the reason I often put so much up here is not that I want you to have to remember all of that and write it all down. The reason I put so much up there is because this is the way we work. We work by learning with verbal cues. We learn with seeing things on screen. So I'm just trying to give you lots of information so that you have it not to overwhelm you. So if you want to just sit back and relax, then do that. Go right ahead. So the first one is come in verse 28. Jesus says, come to me. And how I wanted to handle this was give you these words in a different context that help understand what they mean. So here, come, this is like a beckoning. When Jesus called to a dead man in a tomb, this was the word that he used. When he called out to the disciples that they would come follow him. Now you have to understand, when you're a young man in your late teens or early 20s, and a guy who presents himself as a rabbi, and you live in the first century, and a guy who presents himself as a rabbi comes to you and says, come follow me, that really is worthy of dropping whatever you're doing and going and following that person, because to have a rabbi pick you and say, come follow me, meant you're going to part ways with what you used to do and start to live with and learn from him, very much so like we would expect an apprentice would do from, let's say, the 1800s or so. One other example that's not up on the screen is when John is in Revelation and one of the angels appears to him and says, come and I will show you what's going to happen. That's the idea of come here. Labor and heavy laden. Labor is this idea of being wearied by your work. After Jesus has walked 20 or 30 miles in John 4 in a very arid place, he's off to go meet the woman at the well that he knows is going to be there. The text says that in his humanity, this man was wearied. So just think about the last time you walked 20 miles. Okay, maybe 2 miles, but it wears you out, right? This is there. And imagine doing that in a very dry place. And that's this idea of what the Pharisees are presenting is something that just wears you out. The picture there is a sculpt of Hercules. And I was looking through one of my resources that's really cool. You can look at a Greek word and you can see it used in other Greek pieces of literature. And so this is what it says of Hercules, that this is the term that was often used for the strenuous wrestling of the hero. And the hero here is Hercules. So think about a Herculean endeavor. Or for us modern people, think about Captain America. I mean, this is the type of stuff that you would give to somebody who is superhuman. They're the one that's meant to have this difficult of a burden to deal with. The idea of the burden is that it is a lot. It is a ton. This is Moses speaking here in Numbers, and he's communicating these people. This burden is too great. And just imagine if you were in charge of leading 20 or 30,000 people, and you were used to leading 20 or 30 sheep. You'd spent a couple decades doing that, and these people grew up in a really strange context, and now you're in charge of them. Man, that would wear you out. Here's another classical literature example. This is from Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus comes upon Cyclops' club, and in describing how big this club is, he says that he took it, and it looked like it was about as big as the mast of a black ship with 20 oars. And then he defines the type of ship, a cargo ship. And that's that idea of heavy laden. Like, this is more than a human is intended to carry. This is a large amount, something that would fit within a ship that has 20 oars. Just let's look at that. I mean, we would say maybe we could take 1/2 of these rows, and about 3/4 of it would be the type of cargo that would fit into a ship that's its expressed purpose is only to transport goods from one location to another. This is a lot that Jesus says these Pharisees are putting on the people and that these people have. Well, how about rest? Rest is to break from work. After a really busy day of ministry, Jesus says to the disciples, you haven't even been able to take a bite to eat. Why don't you come away with me? Let's take a break. It's used of those when thinking about parents. So here, moms and dads. Just imagine, dads, a child that received no discipline and how unrestful that child would be to you. Think here maybe of boys as opposed to girls. They kind of have a knack for being a little more boisterous and adventurous. And now moms, think about a child who loves Jesus. I mean, can you think about something that's more restful than at the end of your 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years worth of parenting, you can sit back and go, the most important thing, I worked hard to show this kid the value of Jesus, and they see it now. That brings on this overwhelming amount of rest, and that's that idea of this rest that Jesus says he provides. He says, I will give you rest. Those who are labored and heavy laden, this is the rest that I provide. How about yoke? Pretty straightforward. Here's a canoe yoke. I think in the text, the idea would probably be more along the lines of a yoke that you would find on oxen, where you have two animals that are together and they're plowing. It has this idea of being connected with someone else. I don't really need to explain that one more. Gentle. Here Jesus defines what he's like. He says, take my yoke upon you, my way of living, and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. A while back, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was this push against red letter Bibles. Maybe some of you have Bibles that have the red letters, which are the words of Christ. And it's a good idea that you can see the words of Christ in red. Some people would push against it, maybe still do today, and they say, well, you're giving undue weight to the words of Jesus over what you might find somewhere else in, let's say, the Old Testament, Proverbs, or 2 Samuel, or maybe if the New Testament, if you go to, 1 Peter. You're giving undue weight to these words of Jesus in red. And I want to say, well, let's just take a moment. Let's stop and think. This is how Jesus is presenting us to himself. These are the words of Jesus. And when he presents himself to these people there, he says, I am gentle and I am lowly in heart. What does he mean when he says that? Well, gentle, same word used in the Beatitudes for the meek person. Remember I said last week, the Beatitudes are not a list of things that you need to be in order to be kingdom worthy. They are the gates that are opened to all those that are welcome, including the lowest of the low. And Jesus says, this is what I'm like. I'm unassuming. I would come to your church. I would make myself known because I'm talking to people. But if we didn't connect, I'm so lowly that you probably wouldn't have even recognized that I was there. I would just blend in with the crowd. Same picture in Matthew 21. Kind of humorous to think about somebody presenting themselves on a donkey. A little anticlimactic, yes? It's not what we think about when a conquering king comes in. Or when Peter is talking about how women are to adorn themselves, he says it's not about the outside. It's not the clothing or the dress. It's not the makeup. It's not the earrings or the jewelry. He says it's the gentle and quiet spirit. And so, of course, if God is the author of life, we would find that Jesus has attributes that we would often associate with feminine individuals or characters. That's the type of God that he is. He is gentle. How about lowly? Well, the focus of this word is one of low position. And he says specifically of his heart, he is lowly. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Take a moment to think about who you consider the lowly. Those that you, for the most part, wouldn't have a hard time walking by. They're so lowly. In Leviticus 27, we get a really helpful picture. Here, the law is dictating when somebody comes and offers a sacrifice, which they're obliged to do, they need to make sure that their offering matches their financial wherewithal. And so for those who had enough, they would provide a full-size animal. And for those who didn't have enough, it would be less. And then for those who had very little, it would be a couple doves. But then for those who had hardly anything, then the priest would step in and he would say, well, this is going to fit the situation or the condition. So if somebody is too poor to pay, then the priest will step in. This is that same term there. If you just have so little, it's basically nothing. That's the level of lowness we're talking about. And Jesus says this is true of his heart. I got a book here, Gentle and Lowly. And this is what Dane Ortland says about this. He says, the point in Jesus saying that he is lowly is that he is accessible. For all his resplendent glory and dazzling holiness, his supreme uniqueness and otherness, no one in human history has ever been more approachable than Jesus Christ. No prerequisites, no hoops to jump through. The minimum bar to be enfolded into the embrace of Jesus is simply this: open yourself up to him. It's all he needs. Indeed, it is the only thing he works with. Your very burden is what qualifies you to come. No payment is required. He says, I will give you rest. And so when Jesus is speaking of himself as lowly in heart, he is saying, this is for everybody. It doesn't make a difference what's there. It's for everybody. Souls is the core of a person, the sum of the parts of their personhood. Jesus says, don't be anxious about your life. Here we see it's very practical in nature, what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink. This idea of soul is not just this thing that we think about that maybe separates from our bodies and goes up into some other location. This is who we are as people, physically. This is who we are. And then in Acts 15, it also involves our thinking. Since we have heard that some persons have gone out from us and troubled you with words, unsettling your minds. And so the soul of a person isn't just this immaterial, it's also the material. It's the whole. And Jesus says, the rest that I provide, it's for all of you, emotionally, relationally, physically, spiritually. I provide to you rest for all of this difficulty that you face with these heavy burdens. Well, what about his yoke? He says his yoke is easy and his burden is light. I don't think the ESV quite captures it, and maybe the text just can't. Maybe sometimes that's what happens when we have translations. But easy is not only this idea of, well, this water bottle is easy for me to pick up, or it's easy for me to press the button and function, but that it's actually good. There's one example there on the bottom of grapes, or figs, talking about how the figs are very good. Or in Ephesians, be kind to one another. There's this, and this easiness, it's like it's a benefit to us. For those of you who, I don't know, let's say you grew up riding in the back of your dad's pickup truck, in the bench seat with no headrest and really no contour for your body. It was just something firm here and something firm here, and sometimes it was angled like this and sometimes it was angled like this, and just uncomfortable. And then you get moved to first class, right? The time comes when you can go sit in the front seat of dad's truck. Well, if it was like my dad's truck, you still were upgraded to another bench seat. But then, years later, he gets a different one. Or you get a car and then you sit in it and you go, oh, this seat is easy. This seat is good. Or for those of you who have foot troubles, think about custom orthotics or shoes that finally have cushioning on the bottom of them. I'm a small guy. Obvious to you, right? But I used to run a lot. I don't run a lot much anymore because I have pretty substantial foot pain on a routine basis. And so I have not quite custom orthotics, but probably have some due sometime soon. And I'm running in Hokas. And if you don't know Hokas are, I don't do this because I'm short with these big, gigantic lifts on here. You might think if you ever see Libby and I stand next to one another that it's because I have a short complex. I don't. My wife is taller than me. It's just the nature of it. But there was supposed to be a laugh there. There was nothing. Okay. All right. Okay. So anyways, the Hokas, they have such substantial cushioning, and they're really intended for people who have troubles with feet. And I was talking to the podiatrist a couple months back, and she said to me, well, you have a really small frame, but your feet are so weird that you really should be running in the shoes that have the most cushioning. And then I put these on, and I went, oh, these are good. I mean, here I am thinking, well, I hardly weigh anything. I should be able to run in minimalist shoes. And I even tried it, and my feet would kill me. And now I walk around on clouds, and it's lovely. These are good shoes. They are kind to my feet. That's what Jesus says. Let me push this forward a little bit more. Here's that yoke again. And on the top, it's the typical yoke. This is what you would find on an Old Town canoe, or on what you'd find on a Winona, or I don't know, something else, the typical canoe brand that you would know. It really isn't all that helpful. I mean, it's got a cutout there for your neck, but if you've ever carried a canoe, you know it doesn't feel good. All it does is it takes the pressure it would put on your spine, and instead it puts it on your shoulders, right? And it's just very flat. But below that is a custom yoke. And notice how it has contours and shape to it, and there's concave and convex bits to it, and it looks like it's molded for a human's body. Well, this is what Jesus is talking about. He says the other yoke is that way, and this yoke is this way. It fits, it feels good, it doesn't seem out of place. And then he says this burden of his is light. It is light, and just as you might expect, light means light. Here's a couple ways for you to think about it. In Job is responding to one of his friends who's shown up, and they're arguing through this issue of why do the righteous suffer? And Job is talking about how evil people seem like sometimes they have a good life, and his friends are saying, no, when people are evil, they have a bad life. And Job is saying, no, there are some times when people who live an unrighteous life have a very easy-looking life. And he's saying, well, it appears as though they're like foam on the water. And think about how light foam on the water is. That's abundantly light. Or Paul says in 2 Corinthians, when comparing the, let's say, 60 to 80 years of life on earth as a human and all the difficulty that that's associated with, and then comparing all the joy from then whenever you go into eternity, he says this 80 or 100 years goes like that, and it's light and momentary. It's so small. Jesus says this is what his burden is like. Okay, there's the terms. What's the meaning? I think it's pretty straightforward. I think it is as beautiful and wonderful as it appears. Jesus is saying, what the Pharisees are telling you need to do to be a worshiper of God is total garbage. What I'm telling you that you need to do is total beauty. It is as good as I'm making it out to be. I have done the work. This is why his burden is difficult. That's why the burden of the Pharisees is hard, is because they're saying it is really 614 or 613 commands, plus then also we have all this oral tradition that's there. And Jesus' yoke, brothers and sisters, this is it. That he has purchased for us, like Paul talks about in Romans. God has done what the law could not do by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin. He condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us. So take a moment. Jesus has bought for you entrance into God's presence. And like he talks about Dane Ortland in this book, the only thing that you have to do is to say, I need help, and you are my means of help. Please save me. That's it. That's the low level that the bar is set at. And it's more complicated than that, of course. Nothing's ever quite that simple, but this is what Jesus provides to us. Would we come after him? Well, what does that say about the Pharisees? That says that the Pharisees are actually presenting something different. They're presenting a way of living that's very hard. And so if we move on to, does this really fit? Let's go through Matthew 12 really fast. We're going to take, 5 minutes to walk through what could be several sermons worth of material, but the point here is only to understand, is this what Matthew is doing? In Matthew's story, remember, this is his story, and he's presenting this Messiah as king, and there's conflict with the Pharisees. Is Matthew going to show us the same is true, that Jesus provides easy and they provide hard? He would have to evidence a couple things. Here's what he evidences. In verses 1 through 8 of chapter 12, they don't understand the law. They don't get it. When Jim read, and this is where he was talking about, their disciples are walking through the grain fields, and they grab plucks of grain, or they pluck pieces of grain, and they rub it in their hands to get rid of the chaff, and then they're eating. They just don't understand the law. They have things so confused in their mind. Jesus says, well, the law kind of points to somebody else, and hey, by the way, that's me. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He is the literal Word of God, as John talks about. And then in 9 through 14, he shows that they don't understand mercy and love. This yoke of theirs, Jesus is saying, and Matthew is using this as his rhetorical tool, this yoke of theirs, it is burdensome because it orders things incorrectly. And we do this in America, right? We say it is okay for certain groups of people to speed, right? Police officers, paramedics, anybody who's in a desperate emergency, The law is there to serve us. And so if in order to serve somebody, we need to violate the law, then we will do that within reason. That's perfectly acceptable for us to do. Same thing is going on here. How about 15 through 21, where they're denying the Scriptures? Now Matthew inserts this little bit about Isaiah. Remember I told you Matthew's full of prophecies about the Messiah. And what he's doing in 15 through 21 is he's showing the text is really clear about what Jesus does. He says, then Jesus withdrew from there, and he goes and he heals the people who followed him. Oh, by the way, Matthew says, this was to fulfill very clearly what Isaiah talked about. This is what the Messiah does. I've already shown you this. This is the fulfillment of this character that we've been looking forward to for all this time. Then in 22 through 32, Matthew evidences that they deny the clearest manifestation of God's work. This is that passage with the unforgivable sin. The unforgivable or unpardonable sin is this. It's very simple. It's nothing that you and I can do today. Theologically speaking, there is nothing that you and I can do to commit the unpardonable sin. It does not happen. The unpardonable sin is to see the Son of God through the power of the Spirit of God on earth in the flesh before you by the divine decree of God, doing what the Scriptures had promised will come to pass and saying, that's not God's work. That basically communicates you are so low in the faith category, nothing is going to help you. This is what's talked about when Jesus uses the example of the rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man says, but no, go and send somebody to go talk to my brothers. And the response is, look, they had the law. That's all they need. They don't need more because unbelief is unbelief. It doesn't make a difference how much you expose to them. Unbelief stays unbelief. There's nothing there to work with. And here Matthew is illustrating the reason why this yoke of the Pharisees is so hard is because it is a yoke of unbelief. It's a yoke that says, really, God doesn't do this. It's us. We have to earn this. How about in 33 through 37? This is merely the fruit of their hearts. Matthew's going to show it also, this is a worship issue. It's not just that they have a wrong perspective, but at their core of what they're trying to do, they're trying to worship God, and this is a wrong way to worship. And so here's this tree, make a tree good and its fruit will be good, or make a tree bad and its fruit will be bad. Here, through Jesus, Matthew is showing this is what's at the heart of the Pharisees. The stuff that's coming out, the reason they're confused about the law and they're saying to people, you're not supposed to heal on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to eat on the Sabbath, is because at their hearts, they don't care about love God and love others. The tree is bad, the fruit is bad because the roots are bad. This lack of faith issue. How about 38 through 42? The sign of Jonah. Kind of weird, isn't it? Talking about all this stuff, and all of a sudden he switches and he says, well, the scribes asked for a sign of Jonah, and Jesus responds and says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. And then drop down to 45. So it will be with this evil generation. There's a theme here that's coming up that fits in with this other theme. This idea of the sign of Jonah is, again, signs will never conquer unbelief. If they want a sign, they have one. I've already shown a multitude, and another one will come. I will die, and I will go in the tomb, and if they then are chosen, they will then come to life. But if they don't, they won't. There's nothing that's going to happen. Two more, 43 through 45. All forms of false worship lead to the same destination. All forms of false worship lead to the same destination. He starts talking about the return of an unclean spirit. Again, this is probably the strangest part to show up in the text here. When an unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest, but finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits, more evil than itself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. So it will also be with this evil generation. People have built demonology ideas. They've built a theology of demons off of this. That's not the point here. The point is, how does it fit in with the text? Remember, when the text zooms in really far, we want to zoom out and say, how does this work? This is part of a forest. It's one tree, but it's part of a forest. Okay. What are the Pharisees doing? They are presenting people in a way before God that they presume is clean, right? 613 or 14 commandments. Do this, do this, do this, do this. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. What do those people look like on the outside? The Pharisees. Put in order. Tidy. Clean. Their house, so to speak, is swept. But what's the problem? The change hasn't affected the deepest level where it's necessitated. So Jesus is pointing out with this example of, if this is in fact how spirits work, we have no idea. Jesus is pointing out, you have to go to the core. You can't just take somebody who looks horrific and give them a whole bunch of laws to obey and make them look clean, and they will be clean. That makes nobody clean. In fact, that puts them in a worse position. That's why he says they'll be in a worse place. Why? Because now, whereas before they looked bad and were bad, now they look good. But they're still bad. And when Jesus presents his woes to the Pharisees in chapter 23, he says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, you are like whitewashed tombs, clean on the outside, but inside you are full of dry, dead bones." And then last, the idea here is wrapped up in Matthew's story with somebody coming and saying, "Look, your mother and your brothers are here." And Jesus says, "My mother and my brothers are those who take up my yoke and follow me. They are people who do the will of my Father in heaven." So I think it fits. I think if we look at this text and we say, what is he talking about in 28 through 30? He's saying, the Pharisees have one way of living, and I have another way. And this way is full of striving and working so hard and being exhausted and never being satisfied because there's always more to do. And the other side is where Jesus buys for us everything that we ever wanted: hope, joy, forgiveness, peace, everything and more. It's all given to us. Let's go back to this example. I took a trip to Canada a couple times. It was a leadership development class. Really enjoyed it. We went to Algonquin Park, which is north of New York State. I've shared this with you before, I think. And while we were there, we spent 2 days working through some materials on looking at people as worshipers and understanding how the text presents this. And then we would, on Monday, head out into the wild and go canoeing and portaging for 5 days. And those canoes, they were like this one. This is an old town. It's about a 17-footer. You could seat 3 people here. Its cargo capacity is large enough that there wouldn't be a problem. We were carrying these really big packs on us, expedition packs that would carry like 40 to 50 pounds worth of weight, so basically like a small child or so. I guess more like a medium-sized child. And you would take the pack off, and you would put the pack right behind the yoke, and then you could fit 3 people there, and all 3 of you would be paddling. Now, these canoes are made out of a material called Royalex. And Royalex was this really well-known and popular material that was used for this type of purpose and others. And then the company who purchased the company that made Royalex decided they no longer wanted to make it, and so they stopped making it. And then they had to find other ways to provide help for canoes. But Royalex was so helpful because relative to other materials, specifically wood, it's lightweight. It can scuff well. That means it will be resistant to scuffs. And in a canoe, when you're going in and out of the water, it's inevitably going to be scuffed up against rocks. And you can recoat it. And it's somewhat lightweight, and it's also very inexpensive, all things considered. So we would be carrying these canoes. We got 50 pounds worth of backpack for our food for the week and all of our needs. And then you'd take the canoe, and you'd put it on. And this canoe, not this specific one, but the one that we would use that was like this, was 18 feet, and it would weigh right around 87 pounds. You ever put 87 pounds on your shoulders? That hurts. How many of you have walked around Elver Park? I was just there yesterday playing Frisbee golf with some guys. Yeah, okay, so you don't have to raise your hands, that's fine. Elver Park. Have you ever walked around in the fields back there in the hills? That's what the portages were like. Minimum 80 meters. Maximum a mile long. And you'd have this canoe, and the way that the yoke is put, if you balance the canoe just so with the yoke on your shoulders, the canoe will be up like this. So obviously you can see where you're walking. So you'd have to put your arms up so that you could hold onto the canoe, and then the yoke would just be pressing down harder and harder. And let me tell you, I would rather take 5 hours of canoeing, paddling, than I would 800 meters of portaging. It was so much work to carry that weight. It was so hard. The first year I was there, that was the case. The second year, the guy who started this program showed up with one of these guys. You recognize that material? It is carbon fiber. It is stronger than steel and way lighter. It has all the properties of Royal X, except 1,000 times better in every way except one, and that is it's way more expensive. And this guy showed up with this canoe, which cost about $5,000 compared to the other ones that were around $1,500 or so, or maybe $900. And do you know how much his canoe weighed compared to the 87 pounds that we were carrying? 35. 35 pounds. 35 pounds. Do you notice something else about that? Let me zoom in on something and show you. What do you notice about the yokes on these two canoes? Do you see how one is contoured? So imagine taking 35 pounds, and then instead of spreading that on 3 square inches of your shoulder, now it drapes over, and all 35 pounds now are weighed on, let's say, 12 or 15 or 18 square inches of your muscles. All of a sudden, it's so much easier. That 35 pounds is still 35 pounds, but now you're carrying it on your frame, and it's not pressing down. This is what makes custom orthotics so lovely, isn't it? To go back to the shoe example, all that weight is now spread on all of your feet instead of a couple points that are sore and hurting. This is what we do in our lives, brothers and sisters. We go back to the old canoe and the old yoke. It doesn't make a difference if you're here and you don't trust Jesus, or if you're here and you do trust Jesus. You need to hear the hope that Jesus offers to us an easier load than the one that we would put on ourselves. In that sense, it doesn't make a difference whether we believe or we don't believe right now. It's that we need to see what he offers to us. If you would have run into Michael Porto 7 years ago, this is what you would have found. You would have found a man who was a father, and I don't really have a social life. I basically work and then I spend my time at home. I try to be at home with my family. So I was husbanding and I was fathering. I was working full-time, right around 45 hours a week. I was involved in local church ministry. I was teaching on a weekly basis. I was remodeling my basement, doing the plumbing by myself. Do you know I'd never plumbed before? I was doing the electrical work by myself. You know I never did electrical work before. I was framing and drywalling by myself. Did you know I never did those things before? I was a seminary student with a full-time seminary load. And on top of all of that, I was running approximately 35 miles a week. Do you know why I was doing that? Because I thought I needed to prove myself. Because as I've shared, I felt so desperately inadequate about who I was that I needed to have all these things that I was doing to evidence I was worthwhile. I was doing the things that I needed to do. And when I look now and I think back 7 years ago and ask, how on earth did I have the energy for that? I don't think it's because I was 7 years younger. I'm really not that old. I think it's because I thought that was the best way to please God. And even though I was a believer, I was looking at my life and I've gotten wrapped up in the trap of thinking, I need to work really hard to prove my value to Jesus. I need to show him that I can do this. And so as believers, this is sometimes what we do to ourselves. We throw all of these burdens on. This is what we need to do. And I just want to be so explicit before I come to the end of this sermon. This is not what we need to do. We just need to believe that God has done what he has said he has done. We need to be filling our minds on a regular daily basis, going to Ephesians, telling ourselves, I'm chosen. I'm a child of God. I'm clean because of the work Jesus has done for me. So what are some implications? Number one, you have a yoke. Whether or not you trust Jesus, you have a yoke. That is, you have a way of living. Ask yourself later on this week, tonight, whenever time is available or convenient for you, ask yourself, what is my yoke? What are the ways that I work hard to try to prove myself to God when in reality I'm just making this burden so much greater than it needs to be? Number 2, there is no person who is too weak for Jesus. If he is gentle and lowly in heart, this is for you. As the book said, all this requires is that you have faith that he can do the things he says that he can do and that you need help. Third, Jesus' yoke involves work. I've really not addressed this at all. Some of you may be thinking it's glaringly obvious, and it is, but he doesn't say that he has no yoke. He does say that his yoke is easy. That is, that it's good. And some days it's really hard. Life is hard to trust God, is a difficult thing to do, and yet it is far greater than the alternative. And so Jesus is not calling you to nothingness. He is calling us to something, but it is there that there's work involved in this, but it's good work. And you can't take up his yoke if you don't do what he says. So here I'm shifting from just look at what Jesus has done, and now we're wrapping up this sermon series, and I'm taking some additional time to say, all right, now, after 9 or so weeks of hearing the gospel, hearing it reinforced, you are not the sum of how well you can one another, but instead, you are chosen, you are a child of God. If you believe and have faith in him, if you trust in what he has done, this is you. Now what? Now that you've dwelt on this, what do you do? Well, here are the one another's, all 37 or so of them. And let me say again, you cannot take up his yoke if you don't do what he says. And so, not in the sense of go do these things so that you are being a one another person. Remember, this is not old covenant thinking, but in the sense of you need to be doing something. Here are ways for you to respond in kind with the one another's. Number 1, get involved. Come to Jesus. If you don't know Jesus, I would love to talk with you about him. A number of people here would love to talk to you about him. If you don't trust in Jesus, or if you think maybe I have this wrong, don't be ashamed. Come to Jesus. The way that you are living is a hard way to live, and nobody needs to live that way. God has provided a way that is so joyful and good. Join a small group. We've got 4 small groups that are actively happening, with one that's soon to start. If you were to jump onto Church Center, you would see a page like this, and those are the different small groups, and you can click a map and it'll show you where they're at. We don't even care how old you are. We don't care if you're involved in other ministries. We would say we would love for you to be involved in a small group, because realistically speaking, we can't one another well on a Sunday morning. There's not time for that. It doesn't happen. And you minister alongside other people. Like we've got guys that come and do AV, and we have people that come and do music. But for the most part, again, we have a goal where we're trying to accomplish something, and so there's not a lot of time for life on life to happen. But small groups are consistent. They're smaller groups, obviously. And like our small group, we get together, we eat a meal together, we share struggles, talk about difficulties, we talk about the text. We really enjoy it. I was out doing Frisbee golf with the guys in small group yesterday, and we've gone fishing. We celebrate birthday parties for one another. Small groups are a wonderful way for us to care for and comfort and do this and don't do that to others and counsel one another and all the other one another's that we talked through. Welcome one another. I mean, that's pretty inherent in inviting somebody to your home, right? So get involved in a small group. And if you don't know where to go to find a small group, talk to me, talk to Rob, talk to Wayne, talk to David Fee, talk to Ryan English. We all have small groups that we're a part of, and we would love to get you plugged in. Be a part of our Bible reading plan. What better way would there be to know that Jesus' yoke is easy and his burden is light than to go to the text on a daily basis and see it over and over? The text is not there to overwhelm you. It's there to remind you of the kindness of God. This fall, we are going to be going through a redemptive historical Bible reading plan. It's only going to be like a month and a half or 2 months long. We're going to flex our muscles from our biblical theology study that we're working on right now in Adult Discipleship Hour. You can maybe see a little bit of it. You don't need to see what's underneath, but you've got this idea of creation and then a multitude of passages from all over the Bible that talk about this theme of creation. And then there's fall, original sin, and judgment, and it goes on down with, 10 or 15 more examples of ways that you can see the big picture of the Bible. This would be such an encouraging thing for you to do. Come to Adult Discipleship Hour. We're covering right now biblical theology. Next is going to be Proverbs through the lens of biblical theology. And I would just encourage you to be there. Let me say, just because most of us have graduated from high school or college doesn't mean that we should stop learning. Readers are leaders. People who learn are people who grow. And so if you want to be stagnant and you want to not change, the best path is to stop being a learner. And I'm not saying the only way to grow and the only way to not be stagnant is to come to Adult Discipleship Hour, but it is a really easy and simple step forward to make. Do you have to wake up early? Yeah, you do. You have to wake up early. Do you have to sit here with these people longer? Yes, you do. You have to do that. There are have-tos involved in this, but again, if his yoke is easy and his burden is light, and in Adult Discipleship Hour, the goal is to help you see the value and the goodness of Jesus, then it is work, but it's better than the alternative. When I meet with people, typically I say this: if you want to change, you have to think about change differently. You have to think about it like you're running a 100-meter dash. One day you're going to have to show up, and you're going to line up on that line, and the starting gun is going to fire, and you are going to have to run. You are going to have to do that one day. And if you think that Usain Bolt is a fool for having practiced over and over and over and over again for years so that he could be the fastest person ever, he's going to laugh at you when he runs across the finish line at 9.58 seconds as he blows by everybody else who's ever tried to do it, because Usain Bolt understands that to show up on race day is good, to be prepared. And you and I are going to face things in life. We don't know what God's going to give to us. We don't know what's going to happen. And so we want to run into our life with joy. And one day something might be asked of you, difficult situation. Maybe your parent or loved one's going to die. Maybe a child is going to introduce a really difficult dynamic into your life. Maybe work is going to end or drastically change. Something is going to take place. On that day, you will not be a fool because you've chosen the yoke that teaches, and you've chosen the yoke that influences so that you grow. And then maybe that day when the trial comes, you can laugh at it and you can say, my God is so much greater. My God is so much better. Think of ways that you can serve. Here are a number of very simple ones that we could easily get you plugged into today. And let me just say, for those of you who are already plugged in about a half a dozen ways, I'm not talking to you, okay? There are some of you here, and those of you who aren't involved, you need to hear this. There are some here who bear very substantial loads at Memorial. And we would love for those of you who come and attend to be involved in more, not just so that we can use you. That's not the point. The point is so that we can be together working to do what God is doing, and also out of brotherly love and sisterly love to care for those in this flock who work hard, because there are some here that we just have no idea how hard they work, and you sit down and you spend time with them and you go, that's a lot, you're doing a lot. I don't speak of myself here. This is my job, so in many ways it's very different for me. Finally, pick up a good book. I've had 3 of you in the past week share with me that you picked up a book that I recommended. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you for encouraging me in that way, that it's been helpful for you to hear. Here are my recommendations for today. First one's Gentle and Lowly. It's the same book that I have up here. It is only organized around one theme, that is that you might understand how great Jesus is. He talks about Bible texts. He talks about Puritan writers. He talks about other individuals who have written and observed Jesus, great theologians, missionaries, and it's very encouraging. Another one is Desiring God by John Piper. If you just want to have your mind blown and understand that to worship God is to find joy in Him, that is the book that's going to unlock the key for you to understand that. And the last is Trusting God. When I talk with people about trusting God, I often tell them, just imagine an old man who's lived 80 or so years, who's served people for 60 or 70 of those years, sitting down and gently talking with you about your difficulties and nodding his head when you say things are hard, and then saying, yeah, oh, I bet that was hard. And then gently, kindly giving you how Jesus thinks about this and how you can respond. And that's exactly what Jerry Bridges is like. It's like you're sitting with a man who loves you deeply and wants you to see the goodness. If you want to find these books, all of them, as well as some questions for discussion for a small group, and there's one other thing, but I can't remember. Oh, a special surprise. That is all for you on Church Center. Some of you reached out to me. Actually, only 2 of you reached out to me last week. Carol was one of them. There's a surprise for you, those of you who are willing to go tap a couple extra taps and find this page on Church Center. It's under Sermon Resources, and I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for your devoted attention. No more exhaustive long sermons from Michael. Back to Jeremy. Okay, let's pray. God, we thank you that your yoke is easy and that your burden is light. And if I have brothers and sisters here who are running the race, the rat race as it's often referred to, like I found myself doing, it's not to say that they don't trust you or know you. It's to say, like was talked about in Calvin's commentaries when he's talking about Isaiah, our hearts are a factory of idols. Or to put it differently, we're constantly coming up with new yokes for ourselves. We do this as humans. We put this on ourselves that we need to measure up, we need to be clean, we need to do that, we need to do this. And change is a part of being a believer, but that change comes not from our efforts. It comes from understanding what you've done and then us responding in light of that. And so that's what I pray, that we would have a better understanding of this call that Jesus has to us. If we are weary and if we are burdened, if we are heavy laden, whether that's because others have put something on us or we have imposed it ourselves, that we would see that Jesus and what he offers is so much greater, that he is gentle and lowly in heart, and that we will find rest for our souls. All of us, all parts of us, God. In your name we pray. Amen.